Afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this week's episode of Getting In, a college coach conversation. So we're recording this today on the other side of December 1st, and a lot of deadlines have already passed. You'll be listening to this episode right around December 10th. We hit the center of the month, and really, I think probably the most active period in terms of the application process. So we're excited to be able to help you with new topics and new ways of understanding how you're going to approach your application today. But we also know that you're probably waiting for decisions from some of those early schools. And that's why we're going to talk in our second segment today about what to do if you get a deferral. And you may also be thinking about some elements of how to pay for college. In our third segment, we'll be talking about scholarship money and how to continue to ensure that you're making the most out of opportunities to finance your education. But for those of you students who are still working on some of those regular decision applications, there's nothing wrong with that. We want to talk about the supplemental essay topics for a couple of really popular schools down in the southeastern part of the United States. And in order to do that, we're going to welcome my colleague, Christine Kenyon, who used to be a resident of the southeastern part of the United States. Christine, hey, welcome to the show.
Hi, Ian. Thank you.
Glad to have you here. So we're talking about, I guess I could say the name of the schools. I've left everybody in suspense here. We've already talked about Georgia Tech, and we've talked about the University of Georgia. Today we're going to talk about Elon, which is in North Carolina, and we're going to talk about the University of Miami, which is in Miami. Now, CK, I don't know, do you have a preference over which of the two of these essays you want to start with, or I'll let you choose?
Ooh, let's start with Elon, just because the thought of North Carolina right now, the weather is probably really beautiful there.
Love it. Okay. That is a perfect reason to start with Elon. So Elon has two different writing assignments. Let's start with the second, the actual essay. So the short prompt that they give you here, and I love that this is so short. As you look into the future, what gives you hope? It's a 250-word maximum essay, which is quite a short essay, fairly typical for these supplemental pieces. How would you encourage students to approach this piece, given it is so short, and given that it doesn't have a lot of wiggle room? It's really, it's open-ended in many, many kinds of ways. What do you think?
I think this is a prime example of students giving one example of an experience they've had that has brought them joy, that has made them hopeful over the past couple months, past years through high school. I wonder if Elon changed this supplemental question this summer, with the onset of COVID and everything that's been going on, to just sort of hear what students are thinking for the future, as we navigate such a different time in our world. What makes you hopeful for the future? And I think they really just want you to answer authentically and to give one specific example of something that has made you hopeful, to show how that hope will continue into the future.
So one of the things that we often talk about with every essay is that we want them to be an inch wide and a mile deep, and that you're really sort of missing an opportunity if you try and cram a lot of different content into an essay, especially a short essay, where it's a mile wide and only an inch deep. You touch on this, you touch on that, but you don't get to explore anything in detail. And so you're picking up that same kind of advice here. Find one thing. What is one thing that gives you hope as you look to the future? Now, as you were sort of thinking about how you advise a student to address that prompt, you actually said something from a student's experience, or maybe something that they've already had happen to them in the past that then can be connected to the future. And I think that's kind of interesting, because I think most students would say, all right, I'm just going to look ahead. I'm not going to look back at all. But there is some sense in which you're saying, well, grab from your own experiences. Why is that?
I think in college essays, it makes it much more memorable for the reader when you give a specific example. So if I say kindness is really important to me, and I've been really moved, I'm really moved and hopeful in the future for the kindness I see in young people today. Very nice sentiment, very nice statement, but you may forget it as you start reading the next essay, or the 40th essay of the day, or the 100th essay of the week, or whatever it might be.
Sure.
So I think if you give a specific example where you say, I was having a really low day and I had to go to the grocery store and buy milk, and I was just not feeling great about it. And I put on my mask and I tripped as I was walking in, and someone bent over and picked up my wallet and asked if I was okay from 6 feet away. And that lifted me up a little bit. that story will probably stick with you a little bit longer in your mind
Yeah.
as you continue reading this application or move on to others. And so I think that's where you want to connect past experiences you've had to illustrate the type of hope you hope for in the future.
Yeah, I see that. And I think what you are articulating is also a sense in which there are probably going to be a lot of similar kinds of answers to these questions. And so if you are talking about kindness of others, or if you are talking about sort of the respect that you see in your classmates and how that gives you hope for the future, you are saying things that are probably going to be parroted by other students, of the thousands of other applicants who are applying to Elon. And so the way that you make it your own is by connecting it to an experience that you've had, rather than just talking about that particular value or that particular experience.
Exactly.
Now, it's very interesting because even as I am looking at this prompt and thinking about this prompt, it really does. I think at first you say, as you look into the future, you think about only looking forward, but the what gives you hope is dependent on an experience that came from the past. And I think it's fairly astute to think about it in that way. Now, when it comes to personal experiences that students have had, how do you recommend that they think about identifying those? Is it about a relationship that's really close? How would you choose sort of something? Is it a particular event? Is it a series of events? What makes for really great content here? Maybe it's a know it when you see it kind of thing. I don't know.
Yeah, I think it has to be specific, right? Like going along with the themes of an inch wide and a mile deep. I think it has to be one thing because you don't have space to talk about 4 different experiences over time that changed. It has to be kind of like a snapshot, almost like if you could send a picture in with your application of something hopeful.
Yeah.
Polaroids were big back in the day. You and I were growing up, Ian.
That's right.
Maybe they're making a comeback now. But if you had one Polaroid to attach to your application to show like something giving you hope, maybe it's a photo of you Skyping with your grandparent. Maybe it's a photo of you kicking a ball into a soccer net over the summer. I think that's what you want to think of as a snapshot of a hopeful experience or something that gives you hope as you think about the future.
Now, I think that's right. And in this case, it might even not be an inch wide and a mile deep, but maybe only a half a mile deep or a quarter mile deep because you have only 250 words.
Yes.
But all the examples that you are using are very local, right? So it's very connected to the individual and the individual's experience. And I think that there might be an instinct for some students to say, as I look to the future, what gives me hope is young activists who are focused on the climate or the number of people who turned out to vote this year, right? And that sort of is a commentary on a bigger movement or perspective outside of where that student is. How do you think about sort of choosing between something that is very, very close to you versus something that's happening on a more macro level? Is there a right or a wrong there?
I don't think there's a right or a wrong. I think both are equally valid, and it's entirely dependent on how passionately a student feels about this. Because you're right, there have been so many things that we can reflect upon this year that are bigger than ourselves and our local community that give me hope, certainly. But I think you have to connect it back to you personally. So the issue becomes why. So if it gave you hope to see how many people voted in the election, why? Was it because it was the first time you were able to vote and you felt really connected and excited about casting your first vote? Is it because your birthday was 2 weeks later and you were so devastated that you could not vote in this election and you've become really interested and activism has become a part of your life? I think the why and the explanation is what's important, and that leads itself to the specific example.
Right. That comes back to you when you get to that why. And again, that sort of ties into this idea that lots of people might say they were motivated or hopeful about the turnout in the election, but then bringing it back to why that matters to you really is what helps us to understand who you are in this context. All right. For one very short 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, there are 10 words in that prompt. I think we've done enough on that one. Let's turn to the other one. I love this short prompt that Elon has. They basically have 3 questions. They say, don't think hard, think fast. The maximum answer is 2 sentences per question. And so they're just asking, what brings you joy? Second question is, we're in your hometown. Where should we eat and what should we order? And the third question is, name 3 songs from your perfect playlist. So How do you approach this? Do you really take their advice and think hard or think fast rather than thinking hard? Is there a strategic element to this? Or is it just whatever my initial reaction is, that's what I'm putting in there?
I think that you do want to think fast. You always want to give a second glance over any piece of writing you submit to a college to make sure, that it's appropriate in nature.
That's right.
And given that you don't know who will be reading it. But I think this is a really great example of what's important to Elon as a community. And I think what's really interesting is that these think fast questions and the longer 250 word one, I think they lend themselves to community-based conversations.
Yeah.
They're not academically focused. They're not asking about, the class that you've struggled in and whatever the case may be. I think this is just truly them wanting to get to know you and have some fun in this process. Many admission counselors are fresh out of college themselves. Some of them will have worked at that institution and then work in the admissions office. They're people like you and me who get into this profession because you enjoy and you believe in education. You want to spread access of higher education towards everyone,
Yeah.
and so I think this is just an example of the admission counselors wanting the students to have a little bit of fun. The college admission process is stressful. I think Elon is trying to show their personality that their school is a place where you can have fun and be studious at the same time. And I think this just provides an element of fun, an element of further personality to the application.
Yeah, and we've often sort of poked fun at some of the schools that will they'll have essay prompts that are like, "Don't worry, like just tell us something that you don't think Matt." And it's like it's no pressure, but it immediately feels like there's pressure.
Yes.
And I think what's great about these is that there really is very low pressure on these. They are just trying to learn a little bit about who you are, and I think that there's some of just the fun element of these comes out in that respect. One recommendation that I would make for students is you're tackling this. Write multiple different answers for each question. So, and see what comes best. I mean, the what brings you joy, you might say your family, which is great, but there are gonna be a lot of people that are gonna say my family brings me joy in that first sentence. So maybe it's your second or your third option that does a little bit more to differentiate you from the pack. And so give yourself a few goes at answering these three questions. It's only 2 sentences, so it's not gonna be a lot of extra work.
And I think you also wanna keep in mind that any opportunity to write additional responses in a college application, you should write about something different. So if what brings you joy is your family, 3 songs from your perfect playlist shouldn't be songs that your family wrote and produced and recorded.
That's
and
right.
Your 250 word prompt shouldn't be what gives you hope for the future is your family,
My family.
right? So
Yeah.
you want to differentiate and make sure that each thing you write about highlights a different aspect of yourself and lets the reader know a little bit more about you.
That's a great reminder to use all the pieces of the application to talk about different sides of yourself rather than shining a light brighter on the same thing over and over again. All right, let's turn to the University of Miami. Now, they had historically not had an essay prompt. And I think this is the first year that they've had it in a while. Yeah. So I remember seeing this on the schedule for the podcast. And I was like, why are we doing University of Miami? That makes no sense. And I went and looked it up. And I don't have any students applying there this year. And then discovered, oh, wow, they do have an essay prompt. So it's kind of different from Elon in that there is a longer preamble. And some of these questions, you will get a preamble. And they're talking about their mascot being the ibis, and the ibis being this bird that emerges at first after a hurricane hits. And the question is, considering your ability to control your own motivation and behavior, how have past experiences helped you build your courage and resilience to persist in the face of academic and life challenges so that once storms pass, you can emerge in continued pursuit of your goals? It's a lot there. How do you start to break down a prompt that has so much text to it into the specific question that's being asked?
Yeah, that's a good one. I think this is a good case of kind of talking through an essay prompt before you sit down to write and really kind of thinking through it. I do think the intro about the ibis is just to give you background. I don't know if anybody who doesn't live in South Florida or is familiar with hurricanes would know about the ibis. And so I think it's a really vivid example, and it's like so cool that they use this explanation. But what I would hone in on is, okay, courage and resilience. That's what stands out to me in that first part, right? And then in the second part, I think they're trying not to make students overthink this or be too nervous about it when they say, considering your ability to control your own motivation and behavior, right?
Mm-hmm.
So they understand you can't control all the things happening, in the world, and that's okay. They just want to know, what's a past experience that helped you build your courage and resilience? And I'd stop there and I'd start thinking about that first.
Yeah, I think that's a great way of breaking this thing down. It's really interesting because I always say that, colleges like to use a preamble to help teach students a little bit about what they're going to get if they come to that school. And it's strange for Miami to remind students that hurricanes come through Florida. It's like, just so you know, this is a place where, putting that aside, I think you're right. And I think one of the traps of this essay prompt, and I hear it a lot from students when they're writing their personal essay, is I don't have a big obstacle I've overcome. Like, I haven't had these enormous tragedies in my life. And I think that a lot of students who are applying to Miami might be in that same position when they look at this prompt. It's like, okay, well, I figured out how to write my personal essay, but now I'm being very explicitly asked about past experiences that have shaped or built my courage and resilience. And I think, this isn't necessarily saying, what are the big obstacles that you've overcome, or tell us about something that went really badly in your life. We all experiences academic and life challenges, and they can happen on a small scale. They can happen on a larger scale. It's often outside of our control. I love that you're sort of pointing to courage and resilience as being the things to pay attention to, rather than academic and life challenges, right? So we're thinking more about the positive values that come out of it, rather than, the negative experiences that may have created those values.
Yes.
What other thoughts to share? Is there any, I would love to say that Miami is looking for a particular kind of thing in their prompts, but this is the first year they've had it in a really long time. And so it's quite unusual for them to have an essay to begin with. Is there anything else that you might sort of encourage students to do with respect to this essay? Does it, to you, feel like ultimately somewhat of a conventional question, even given the sort of unusual nature of the preamble of the prompt?
Yes, I think for this year, I think we've seen a lot of schools kind of shift some of their personal statements this year to be a little bit more thoughtful in terms of the world we're living in. And so what I would say is think about courage and resilience, and note that says in the face of academic and life challenges. I think it can be either or. You have 250 words. Don't try and talk about both an academic and a life challenge that you faced, and don't feel as though it has to be something huge and substantial. It can be the story of, an experience you had in passing at your job, in dealing with COVID-19 and quarantine, whatever the case may be. I think they're just trying to get to know who has grit in this applicant pool, and who is going to be able to weather the ups and downs of the college experience that typically happens in an average year, and then throw in a global pandemic, and let's see how things go.
That's right. Yeah. And ultimately it's about you. It comes back to that individual, as you're saying. So we've had this major shared experience as a collective society, as a globe, right, with the pandemic. But also bring it back to you. That courage and resilience is, I think, how you personalize and individualize your response. All right, CK. I think that about covers it for these two. Hopefully that's helpful for you listeners that are applying to those schools. But Christine, I want to thank you for coming on the show and talking through this stuff with us.
Thank you, Ian.
When we come back, we're going to talk about what to do if you are deferred, and we'll have some great tips for you. So don't go away.